Awesome.
Okay, so for everybody just joining us today, I'm interviewing Jodi Calahoo Stonehouse. She's the MLA for Edmonton Rutherford, and she's doing very exciting things in her election. She threw her name in. Rachel Notley recently announced that she's stepping down her longtime leadership of the NDP, and so Jodi has announced that she's putting her name in the ring, so we're super excited about that.
Thank you, Fiona. It's good to be with all of you today. Ambashtet, Danse, Oki. It's a beautiful day of blessings. I want to give thanks to Creator, and I want to give thanks to you, Fiona, for making space for me with your friends, your followers. It means a lot, and all the work that you're doing around advocacy, speaking up. This is leadership. Is that when we see that there's injustice or harm, we speak up and we do something. And so I'm a fan of you.
Miigwech, thank you so much for noticing my efforts. It's a lot of unpaid work. I've been trying to transition from education to being a journalist. Hasn't been easy.
And you're great. You're great.
Thank you.
Keep following your dream. That's for all of you. Follow your dreams. No matter how the obstacles, and there are barriers and there are obstacles and there are glass walls and glass ceilings, and you'll get cut from the shatters, but it's really important that you keep doing what you love, what matters to you. Life is really short and precious, and you have to fill your cup. And at the same time, while you're filling your cup, you have to make space for others and bring others along with you. That's who we are. We're a collective peoples. There was always room for everyone in this circle. You know, elders teach us that no one gets left behind. And so how can we do that in times now where the economy is shifting, climate change? How do we make sure that no one gets left behind? And that's our work as journalists, as viewers, as politicians. We're all doing this work together. It's not one more than the other. We all need each other to do the work.
Oh, miigwech for those very wise words. Absolutely. It's all about making those connections and building up our community to where it once was. And, you know, it's the 7 teachings. Thank you so much for introducing it that way. I love that introduction. Okay.
All right.
So if we want to
get
get
the tough
right
questions for me.
Okay, so I wanted to talk about your previous political career. Many people have referenced you as being a rookie in politics, but that really isn't the case. So would you like to talk about
Sure. Thank you. So when we think about politics, there's also, you know, the personal is political. And so if we think about our lives are highly political as Indigenous peoples recovering from genocide. And so when I think about my first political work, it actually was when I was young. And so it's the way you advocate when you see injustices, as I was mentioning earlier. Like, these are the ways that we become political. And so my first official sort of political work was I was on council for 2 terms in my nation. I've spent time studying governance and working in governance across Turtle Island with different nations, supporting nations. And also at the post-secondary level, I did some teaching around social innovation, Indigenous innovation, the Wahkotowin Governance and Law Lodge at the Faculty of Law at the University of Alberta.
Okay.
I was part of building that. So how, you know, if we think of Canada as a multi-juridical states, we have common law and civil law, and we also have Indigenous law. So the University of Victoria offers a degree in Indigenous legal theory, so you can graduate with your Juris Doctorate in Indigenous law, which means then now that we have lawyers graduating with Indigenous law, we have to start transforming the judicial system to recognize that practice. So there's a tremendous amount of work that we have to do, and luckily I've been blessed to be a part of those processes, to learn from great folks like Dr. John Burroughs, Dr. Val Napoleon, but also the elders. Like, the time I've been blessed to spend with elders across Turtle Island, whether Mi'kma'ki or Halkaminam, Coast Salish speaking. All of the knowledge that I have was gifted to me from the old people. So I'm not coming up with anything new or anything wise, or I'm not this bright, highly intelligent person. I just listen to our elders. And so bringing their medicine, their teachings, along with me. And so when we think about, she's a rookie politician or a rookie MLA, well, the fact is I am in that space. However, on the ground, I've been advocating for missing and murdered Indigenous women. I've been doing work on water for decades. My research was a Master's of Science in Resource Economics and Environmental Sociology. I studied under Dr. David Schindler, and I was looking at water downstream from the Alberta oil sands. And I was looking at mothers, grandmothers, granddaughters, great-grandmothers' stories about water, because our stories are rich. Our stories carry so much knowledge. They carry things around population numbers, observations of ecosystems and biodiversity. And so, those were the gifts that were gifted to me when I was up in Fort Chipewyan. And I may be a rookie at some things, but I'll tell you what, rookies take slap shots, they score goals, and they win games.
I love that metaphor. I'm a big hockey fan, so
As am I.
I will take that any day. I love what you're fighting for. I love first and foremost that you're putting, climate, and you're putting the water crisis at the forefront of your campaign, because it's so important, especially thankfully we have snow, but we were looking at very serious conditions of drought, and I was reading so much about the drought and how a lot of Alberta's water is already used up, like the resources are already used up. It says that animal agriculture is the #1 stressor of climate change, and yet Alberta is cattle country. So what do you have to say about that?
Okay, so first I just want to acknowledge the water, and that also comes from the elders. Water is life. We talk about that right when we're children, and being adopted into Bear Clan, the two things we have to protect is children and water. So I've been blessed to take on that obligation and responsibility for, decades. And water, we are headed into a crisis in the province. Even though we have snow, it's not enough snow. And so we need a strategy to move forward, because there are cattle. We are in cattle country. How are we going to grow food, crops for humans and the cattle if we don't have enough water to sustain the population? What is the plan? How do we navigate? So the province now is moving towards what's called water allocation. It's the way the water is legally distributed. It currently is under a regime called first in time, first in right. First Nations don't legally have rights to water. We did not apply under the allocation system, apparently, when they were, of course, treaty rights. Many argue that water is part of that. So this is about renegotiating. Currently, only 11%, as I recall, is owned by individuals, and the rest is corporate entities. And so the province has set up these water tables that will come together and talk about the redistribution of water. There is a First Nations representative for Treaty 8, Treaty 7, but I don't believe there is one for Treaty 6 on the water board. So that's something to look into, to pay attention to, and to also ask to contribute and participate in. How do we as First Nation citizens give advice, give our opinions, share? Because, we've been stewards of the land for generations. And if we look at forest fires, because that's also a phenomenon with climate change, we did what we call prescriptive burning. So when I was a kid, my grandfather would burn specific parts of the land. Mm-hmm. And then it was banned and made illegal to do pre-burning because folks were worried that we'd burn down their houses, their towns.
So
But
frustrating.
yes, but we're going to need to do this again, bring back, revitalize some of the old ways. And we're not just seeing this in Canada, we're seeing this around the world with Indigenous people as we look at sustainability models, because things are changing in the planet because of climate change. So it's about us getting ahead of it so we're not left behind, so that we do have water. We know the catastrophe is coming. In fact, it's already here. We have the driest soil that we've ever had in the past 100 years, according to some of the experts that I've been speaking with. So the soil is dry. So we know this, we know the catastrophes here. What are we going to draw on from our ancestral knowledge? What are we going to draw on from Western science? What are we going to draw on from ranchers and farmers and community members? Because we're all coexisting together so that we can co-design and co-create the solution forward. We have to think about the next 7 generations, which is part of the long-term sustainability plan, which is in our DNA.
It really is.
Around the next generation.
And see, we need to be having these conversations ahead of time. Like, a lot of this information about the First Nations and the water allocation, I had no clue. Like, we don't talk about these until we're in times of crisis. And like you said, we need to be on top of it. We need to be everybody at the table and not just certain invited parties.
That's part of the treaty responsibility. When my chop on sat down and signed that treaty with the commissioner, that X was put down, as long as the sun shines and the grass grows and the rivers flow, that we would live as relatives. And when we live as relatives, we look after each other, we look after one another. And so there's no room and space for racism or exclusion. All of us are Albertans or Canadians or Treaty 6, 7, 8 members. We all live here, and we're all going to need the solutions collectively, which is part of what I bring to the legislature, is that ancestral knowledge and the wisdom of the elders. And that's the beauty of being Indigenous, is we come from these rich laws, these rich practices, and it's about sharing. It's about opening up our value system and sharing with others.
Well, and sharing the knowledge. Our voices have been silenced for so long, and now that we are able to share our knowledge, we have to, share the elders' knowledge before it disappears, right?
Yes.
It is. What was I going to mention next?
You did. So we didn't talk a lot about the cattle. So that is definitely something we have to discuss, and we have to figure out a strategy. And this is about where we use innovation. There is no reason, because let's face it, I love my moose meat, I love my steak, and there are many people who, especially in Alberta, love their Alberta beef. So we need to start looking at solutions. We know what the problem is. It's the carbon, it's the nitrogen, it's the manure. So we have to figure out, how do we get our post-secondary institutions, which means investing in our education institutions, investing in our people, so we can come up with innovative solutions so that people can continue to have their milk, their beef, as well as that we can still harvest our moose, our rabbits, our fish. We also have to protect them. So it's about protecting all of the species, because currently what we're seeing, because of the weather patterns, there's things like the ticks. The ticks aren't dying. The pine beetle, diseases, and so we have to look after all of the species so that what we eat, like if we think about Pamatsuwin, meal Pamatsuwin, it's about eating our traditional foods, or eating the foods that nourish our bodies, our spirits. And if the food is not well, the plants, the berries, the cattle, then we're not going to be well. Mm-hmm. So we're going to have to work really hard to reduce the carbon emissions. And that means, I know a lot of us don't want to give up our cars. We don't want to give up our cell phones. We don't want to give up our FaceTimes. We love technology. We love the plastic bling. So how do we have these things with reducing our carbon footprint? This is about finding solutions and being innovative. We know we need oil and gas because our houses are heated, we drive our cars, unless we figure out solutions that are going to be different. And that means we have to be brave. We have to be brave, and we have to demand that our governments work with industry and citizens to transform the world that we live in. And it's going to take all of us. I'm sorry, I can't read your questions. I don't have my glasses.
I do, but the writing is just, I have my contacts in for once, but the writing is quite tiny. And like, that's what I mean, like the current system as it is, like the current agriculture system, like it's hurting the earth. And we need to look at different sources of energy, different, ways of raising cattle and meats, and maybe, lowering the cattle numbers is something we need to look at. It's something I've thought about for sure, is just like lowering my meat intake personally, just not having it every meal, because you look at how much a plant-based diet is like a little bit healthier for the earth, I guess, but that's something Albertans don't want to talk about.
Well, and I think these are the conversations we have to have. They're uncomfortable and they're hard, and we're all equally attached to what we believe. And so we have to come into safe spaces to disagree, and we have to work together to find solutions, because not having water impacts all of us, not just a few of us.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. When the water doesn't flow, it doesn't only affect our treaties, it affects all of us. It does. Okay. So I want to kind of step away a little bit from your platform, and I want to talk a little bit about the indigenous issues, specifically that affect us in Alberta, because I'm coming from Manitoba, and we had such a high urban indigenous population, and then I come to Alberta and there's a very high rural indigenous population, and it's very scattered, right? So what do we have to say about like the high rate of like homelessness in Edmonton? Like that has been a huge issue, and something I don't hear a lot of calls to action being brought forward.
That's a really important question. And so statistically in Alberta, 50% of First Nations live on reserve and off reserve. So we have equal rural and urban. And the houselessness is a huge crisis, and we know this because the last intake, I think, was 8,000 folks in the city of Edmonton alone were battling houselessness. And so, again, this is about working together. So this means the federal government, the indigenous governments, so that's the First Nations representation, their councils, the Métis Nation, the Métis settlements, along with the provincial government and the municipalities. We have to come together and strategize a long-term plan, because what's happening, we know on our nations that there's a housing crisis. Oftentimes we see 2 to 3 families per household. And so people come to the city looking for housing, which there's not a lot of affordable or low-income housing. And so people often end up leaving their communities, which they didn't want to leave, because there's no housing. So we need a strategy to work with both spaces and places to build affordable, accessible housing. And then we'll ease the tension on the city. The city of Edmonton alone cannot solve the problem. But if all government bodies, all of the governance, if they all work together, we can solve the problem. Mm-hmm. We don't need mansions. We don't need fancy apartment buildings. We just need houses that have heaters. We'll make them fancy with our blankets. Don't worry about that. Right? This is we know how to decorate. But the fact is it's possible. And if we look at the economics of it, the cost on the system, there was over 800 amputations last winter. Mm-hmm. Also, if we look for the calls for service for ambulance, hospitals, and the overcrowding of hospitals, which means when there is an emergency, you're waiting 8 hours to 10 hours because folks who maybe didn't need to be in emergency are in emergency because they have nowhere else to go. So it's about looking at the economics that we are spending on houselessness and the way we're not supporting it, and what it would look like to build houses. And it's not just building houses. We also need wraparound services. Many of our relatives have complex needs. Mm-hmm. This is the reality of surviving genocide, the reality of being Indian residential school survivors, 60 Scoop survivors, millennial Scoop, the child welfare system. We have, trauma. And we know from Dr. Gabor Mate's work, Dr. Bruce Perry's work, that trauma on the brain impacts decision making. And then you can compound that with addictions. You compound that with post-traumatic stress disorder. And then we have folks with complex needs. So let's build housing and supports for our relatives who have complex needs. This is what we need to do. And it needs to be not 9 to 5, because that's not when the crisis happens. The crisis happens at 3 a.m. We have to make sure people have access to the supports they need. We saw during COVID that domestic violence tripled. That means our women are vulnerable. And that's why we have to build housing that protects our women, keeps our women safe. But we also have to build services to work with our men. We have to do the work to transform, to undo the harm, so that we can live in relation in a better way. And it's work. It's going to be work. And it's changing the systems, fixing the systems, so we stop compounding them. We have to stop apprehending children and work with moms and dads. Mm-hmm. We have to support moms and dads so that way they can raise their children and be healthy, happy, thriving children.
Well, absolutely, because I love how you made the connection to residential school survivors, because both of my parents went to residential school, so it's a very motivating subject for me. But it's the healing. We don't get a lot of support to do the healing, and I know, to get mental health help, to get any kind of help mental health wise in Alberta, the waiting list is huge. To even try to find a family doctor, I was looking into that and I was like, Lord, what did I get myself into?
Yeah, mental health. For First Nations to get therapists, to get, under the FNIB, it's months, 6 months, 8 months. And then addictions, that's also very real. Our people are dying from addictions, and it's not because we're addicts, it's to numb the pain from the trauma. Mm-hmm. And so dealing the healing work is, that's our responsibility, this generation.
Absolutely. And we see the fact that we need the healing in the high rates of the incarceration, the high rates of kids in care, the high rates of homelessness, and the high rates of people being being affected by addictions. It's all just these compounding problems when we could have just had support for the healing in the first place. And that's, conversation wise, we need to have more conversations, more calls to action, more just more bills passed that give us the funding in place, Okay, I wanted to talk about something.
Okay.
And this is my bonus question. Okay. I don't know if have you heard the recent controversy with Danger Cats?
No.
Okay, so they're actually a comedy group, and they're from Alberta, and they've been traveling across Canada.
They made a shirt
about
Picton.
They made a shirt about Picton, and this was they immediately sold out, which was the most disheartening part. They made a joke about residential schools, and I find it a little bit frustrating that they were able to get the bravado and get the support enough to think that they could tour across Canada with these jokes. So I find the inherent lack of knowledge in Alberta about residential schools and about the healing. There is a lot of ignorance here, unfortunately, and it's topics that we don't get talked about in schools and education-wise. And so how do you feel about that?
That's a really important question that we have to talk about when things trigger our trauma. And that's what it does. It's a reminder of the family members of ours that were murdered, or that were taken away far too soon, that are incarcerated. It is a way not only for non-Indigenous people to talk about the reality, but for us, it's really deep. The wound is deep, and it reopens the wound without offering a healing method, without offering a form of transforming that pain into something productive, something constructive, something that's going to make life better for those who've been harmed. And so, you know, if these folks made all this money off their shirts and were funding a school for indigenous children, or some, like if there's a balance in the reciprocity, then that makes sense. But if it's about promoting themselves as comedians, about promoting themselves as business people, then that's just causing harm, and it's not it shouldn't be tolerated. And I would ask them to rethink their strategy on raising awareness. Those are loved ones that we've lost. Those are people who matter to us. Those are our aunts, our sisters, our friends. And you know, for me it's really personal. My oldest daughter, who I adopted, her mom was murdered. And you know, when we think about missing and murdered Indigenous women, it's not just this abstract random data set. These are our family members. And to put it so lightly as a joke or a t-shirt, it actually hurts us. It hurts our feelings, and it reminds us of the loss. So, you know, I would suggest they rethink their strategy.
I think their whole guise was going for the shock factor, and their whole platform was built on, oh, well, we get canceled everywhere, and, you know, we're pushing the boundaries of comedy. But it gets to a point where you're profiting off of our pain. And right slap in the face, right the month that Picton is eligible for day parole, it was very, very triggering, very traumatic for people. And I know, like, we recently passed the bill last year that made, you know, denying and re-traumatizing like Holocaust survivors illegal, right? So if we just rephrase that bill to include residential school survivors and, you know, families of, then maybe we wouldn't be, you know, denied. Then maybe our struggles wouldn't be laughed at and profited off of. Yeah, I don't really talk about it, but my sister has been missing since I was 25. I haven't heard from her, and yeah, we just hope that she's incarcerated somewhere. We hope that she's, you know, just living on the streets somewhere. But when you don't know, it's the not knowing that's the biggest thing. You know, I Google her name all the time, and I hope that something comes up. I can't imagine knowing that they're in a landfill and nobody's looking. I couldn't imagine that.
And this is the work that we have to do as a province and as a country. Alberta has the highest rate of missing and murdered Indigenous women in the country. And this is the work we have to do collectively, because it hurts people. It hurts our families. Indigenous women, we are human beings, and we deserve to live our full lives, to be protected, to be safe. And so that's why we do the work we do. That's why Fiona is fierce. And that's why Jodi is running, because we make change together.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's that empowering each other and building, you know, that those community connections. That's why I was a little bit scared about moving to Alberta, because I had built such a strong base in Manitoba, but Alberta is where I was actually born and raised. I just kind of raised my daughter in small town Manitoba, but once she was raised and once she's, you know, she's going to be 18 this year and she's going to graduate, I'm just like, hey, my job is done. Now I can kind of go focus on
it doesn't
me
end
and
at
my
18
career.
now, I'm sorry to say.
Oh, she's little miss independent. I don't need you, Mom. I'm good. Go do your thing. So I'm just like, okay.
Awesome.
I still pray that she's still gonna, you know, I still wait for those moments that she still needs me and, you know, calls me for this and needs me for that, but it's getting few and far between, and I raised her to be independent. I did it to myself.
The work that we have to do together means that, you know, we do it together and we live together and we celebrate together and we pray together and we feast together because we grieve together. So this is important that we all do this work together. I can't do it alone. Fiona can't do it alone. We really need each other. This is a really critical time in humanity. So, I put it out there to each of you who are watching and listening. Let's connect. Let's work together. Let's change the world together.
It's all about improving it for the next generations to come.
Oh, 7 Gen.
Okay, miigwech, thank you so much for this interview.
Oh, it was so great.
It was really
It was so good. Lots of love to you at home, and to maintain your spirit, make sure you're smudging, doing ceremony, pray how you pray, and we'll see you again.
Miigwech for joining. Thank you.